tempo tribes. When I first starting to go to raves, when I was a teenager in Quebec, I had a formative experience there that really struck me. The way people talked about music, it was really, it was the beginning of tempo tribes. If the music was at 140 BPM and then a year or two later it was at 145, that was a big deal. Then when the music got faster, 150, or then with dark side trance, 155, it was really a big thing. And I never really understood it. I went off to do my music studies, and about 10 years later, I moved to Berlin, and I ran into the same phenomenon again. Different scene, different music, but again, whether the tracks were at 128, if it was 135, it was a really, really big deal. And as a musician and as a researcher, I was really perplexed by what you could call tempo fetishism. And my hypothesis was one of three options. What does this mean? It means, well, maybe the musics don't have many distinguishing characteristics, so we're zeroing in on tempo to distinguish them. Or two, tempo is just a really convenient way to characterize the musics without any specialist music vocabulary. So a way to talk about a vibe without fancy words. Or the third option, maybe tempo is really, really important and it's just a core feature of dance music, and that's why we just instinctively start talking about it. I approach my topic both as a researcher and as an artist. So as a researcher, I really wanted to figure out what this tempo fetishism was about. And as an artist in general, there's a few things I'm looking for. I'm looking for novelty. So in the bigger picture, I'm on a quest for categorically new composition techniques. I'm interested in accessibility, which is why I work on dance music. Dance music is a sandbox where for the music to work, well, people have to be able to groove to it. There's no analysis. It's either it works or it doesn't. So I find it a really convenient place to try out these things. And I'm also interested in mapping out a genre as a tool for finding gaps or finding bridges to new musical territories in the large sense. So when I'm trying to figure out these questions, I'm always on the lookout for these little gaps or these bridges. And finally, I'm interested in figuring out what music is intrinsically electronic. What techniques can we use that are really native to the electronic medium and that can't be done otherwise? So that's kind of the bigger picture that I'm coming from. And techno, I mean, I've been in Berlin for 13 years now, but in the end, it's one case study in this bigger quest. So techno is, like many dance music genres, it's past canon formation, and it's kind of clearly crystallized into a set style. It was initially associated with futurism and machine music, I mean, the name says it. But now, a few decades later, it's really clear what is techno and what's not. And yeah, in that sense, it really seems like a classical tradition. At least that's how I experienced it here in Berlin. And musically, there was a few things I identified that were really core to the genre. Short, repetitive sequences, polymetric patterns, so everything's still on the same grid of 16ths, but with different groupings, different length, and a perfectly steady tempo. The particular flavor I worked on during these years was a heavier industrial sound associated with the Berlin scene. I conducted my research as an independent researcher, and it is practice-led researchers. So what that means is to figure these things out, I get involved in a scene and I try it out. I just do it. I did this research through four approaches, well, four types of outputs: record production, remix production, DJ performance, and live performance. And I will show you some excerpts from all of these and how those help me figure out what is going on with tempo. So a couple years ago, I was working on these ideas, and I set out to map out the boundaries of techno in terms of tempo. So I ended up making an album, this one, the Upward Spiral, that came out on Mute Records. I wrote that in late 2018, 2019. And what I did is I alluded to tempos and rhythmic patterns associated with all sorts of different genres outside of techno, but I kept all the surface sounds, the synth tones, the drum sounds, and the vibe, the textures, very consistent with the home aesthetic. So this metaphor of tempo tribes or islands already started emerging at that point. And I created this parallel in my creative process between the different genres and different sort of geographical territories, and try to find musical techniques that would allow me to bridge between these genres or these musical zones. So on the album, there's 9 tracks, and I started exploring metric modulation as a way to get out of this sort of tempo rigidity. In some cases, I did it really simple, and the more I got accustomed to the technique, the more I explored some more complex, more esoteric applications of the technique. So I will show you 2 examples, a simple one and a more complex one, and we'll see where that takes us. So can you see the screen? And now, so here's a really straightforward one. It's like an acid track. The pattern is in, it's a polymetric pattern of 5. So the acid line loops over every 5 beats. And then in the breakdown, in the middle section, the kick drums emphasize every 5 notes instead of every 4. So we get a feeling of quintuplets and a tempo relationship of 4 to 5. So here it is. So there it is, straightforward. Later on in the track, the process reverses, short break, and then moving the kicks from every 5 grid pulse to every 4. This turned out actually to be very effective in the feedback process. The more complex track on the album is the first one, Embrace Hope, All Ye Who Enter Here, where I explored slightly more complex modulations of 7 to 8, 8 to 9, 6 to 7, 7 to 8, and 8 to 9. This is how that sounds like in the opening. The bass line is in 6, and when the beat comes in, it's in 7. Or the other way around, the bass line is in 7, and the beat is in 6. So here we go. And later on, so the bass line stays constant the whole track. And then I played around taking the bass line as the basic pulse and imposing beats on different groupings. So 7 notes of the bass line in combination with 6 beats in the beginning. And in the second section here, I take 8 notes of the bass line and then 7 beats, and so ever increasing it so the tempo goes a little faster every time. So once that was all done, the release actually took quite a long time, and I was already used to this, working with Mute and Nova Mute previously. So I didn't know how long it would take exactly, but I knew I wouldn't get the sort of feedback I wanted from the audience for quite a while. So along with preparing live performances and DJ performances to try out the material, I got quickly very involved. I took on a lot of remixes in early 2019. This was for 2 reasons. Now that I had some experience with these musical pivots to change tempo in the middle of a track, I wanted to expand on the technique and try it in a few different ways. And again, as this metaphor of musical technique and musical scenes, islands, and tribes, I wanted to do a lot of remixes to have this parallel between musical pivots and audience pivots. A key part of doing the remixes, obviously, is that it involved the original artist, other DJs, and their audience, their scene, which maybe there's a little bit of overlap with mine, but not really. It's not necessarily. It's a big world, and every artist has their own reach. So the first one I did was a remix for Nicole Mudaber. In this case, I focused on a percussive pivot. So as you hear in the example, it's one percussive sound throughout, which is then reframed at 3 different tempi. It was particularly interesting doing this one for Nicole because she works in a very more mainstream context with a wider audience. Whereas I've been in Berlin, really focused on the underground scene here for years. She's playing at places like Coachella, Burning Man, and Ultra Music Festival. So I jumped at the opportunity to do the remix, and I wanted to see how this sort of playing around with tempo would work with that sort of more mainstream audience. So the remix I delivered, I just took one little bit from the original and I went nuts with the technique. And the track has 3 different sections. The track starts at 126 and goes through a 3 to 4 modulation. So going from 126 to 168. Pay attention in the break, just between the sections, that one percussive sound playing, that's the pivot, which we'll hear in the other 2 sections. And now we're in drum and bass land. Next up, going from, at the end of the drum and bass section, I isolate the same pivot sound, so everything else kind of fades out. And we get a 3 to 2 modulation, so 2/3. So we go from 168 to 112. You'll notice it goes from a duple feel to a ternary feel. So we go to triplets. In these early months, I was always in the spirit of accessibility, looking for the really, really simple rhythms that we can all recognize. So 16ths, triplets, and that's it. You don't get much quintuplets or other tuplets in techno. So here I leveraged triplets to get something you couldn't get otherwise. Now, finally, at the end of that last section, to get back to the home tempo, it turns out that we get a really interesting ratio here. Well, interesting because it's a bit more complex. It's not just, well, 3 to 4 or 2 against 3, those are really trivial. We've had those in instrumental music for centuries. And well, this one, we get it because that's what happens when you start stacking the simple ratios. There's a parallel here with tuning. So that was an interesting thing that happened here. This one takes us from 112 to 126. And when you're stacking the ratios, you can get tighter relationships. So instead of large jumps, you can get closely related tempi. And then it's back to the original tempo. I was not able to go to any of the gigs, but I was in close contact with the original artist, Nicole Mudaber, and I sought feedback from her in a very casual way when we were talking over text messaging. I said, I was very curious at that point. I said, hey, how did it go down? How did the people dig the tempo changes? And it was cool. They loved it. She said it went down great. So it gave me confidence that I could go, I could be a bit more daring in these experiments. One of the more esoteric things I ended up exploring in that whole phase is a remix I did for Chris Liebing, where I combined a simple ratio, 3 to 4, but instead of doing it suddenly, I did it as an accelerando. And as it accelerates, the slower tempo, which usually in the metric modulation you would have simultaneously, one after the other, it accelerates. And turns out that when you accelerate in a simple ratio and you pitch up, you also get the interval that with that same ratio. So a 3 to 4 metric modulation implies a transposition of a fourth, because the fourth and third harmonic in the harmonic series is the fourth. So here's how that ended up sounding like. So the whole track is in triplets up until there.
You seem to be muted, Nick.
Sorry, yes, the mic is off.
Thanks. So this is another case where I could see glimpses where the technique could lead to new territories. In this case, I saw that metric modulation was connected to Risset rhythms, where you can get an infinite acceleration, not only at the octave, but other intervals, other rhythmic intervals, like in this case, the fourth. A highlight of this, at that one, I witnessed the performance when Chris played it in one of his sets at Berghain. And that was one of the first times that I could see how the crowd reacted to this sort of thing. And yeah, it was just smooth, it worked, no interruptions, and it just worked fine. DJ performance was a large part of how I gathered the data, whether it works or how the technique works and what possibilities it enables. These were DJ performances by other DJs and also my own. The first time I've witnessed one of these tracks playing was when Daniel Miller DJ'd at Berghain. He played one of the album tracks, Thalassophobia. I observed the crowd, and the transition worked just as in breakdown would. And when the new section played with the new tempo, the crowd just went along with it just fine. This was good news because I was used to being at Berghain and seeing pretty much the same tempo play all night for 10 hours. I received different feedback from different DJs for different tracks. The very first one I showed you, Thalassophobia, received the best response from, I'd say, Thalassophobia, the one that Daniel Miller played, received the best response from more adventurous DJs. Like the Nicole Mudaber remix, it's a track that changes several times. The very first track I showed you in the presentation, Positive Altitude, this one received the best response from, I'd say, like less adventurous DJs. And yeah, it just gave me a feel for how this technique could connect with different audiences. I commissioned a remix from one of my favorite drum and bass producers to sort of close the loop of connecting to other scenes. And what was interesting is that I could see typically techno DJs start integrating this track into their sets. So that was an interesting way of seeing how there could be a bit of mix between the genres. There's one last example I would like to show you. I could have called this presentation Hip Hop at Berghain. One of my goals was to see how far outside of techno I could get away with at Berghain. So I prepared a bit in one of my DJ sets there where I would segue into hip hop. And I recreated that segment of the performance here.
Yeah, microphone checker, quand we hard get dead là. Toute le game est messed up, dead from the net up. Swag, faggot, trap gods, hashtag get lost. Plus de underage dans les choses que dans ce sweatshop. J'run sur la main avec l'adrénaline de rocker. Sors dans la main pendant que j'décapite des walkers. J'cours dans le street à pleines jambes avec une coupe de mes garnements. Là pour chercher le beef et faire du trouble devant le parlement. T'es lame kid, t'as pas de brain bitch, read a book. Toujours marcher dans mon propre chemin au lieu de suivre le groupe. Another J said. Rien bande de cave, il rend du brain dead, embarré dans ma vieille chaîne. Il essaie de me voir à terre à coup de taser gun. Faut que je me téléporte, see you later chum. J'ai des zombies et mes trousses, man, il faut que je run.
So from a straight techno track, I started emphasizing every 6 pulses instead of every 4. That takes the tempo down to 2/3, and then outlining the tempo change with an actual hip hop track and then back. Later on in the set, I tried out playing with more esoteric polyrhythms. 7 to 6 could get me down from drum and bass at 168 to fast techno at 144. And here's where I started to find a gap to new vistas. What I've discovered finally after all this work is that exotic polyrhythms open up a whole new world of tempo modulation. I tried this material out in live performance. I did a live performance at Fabric. The response from the crowd was just fine. So turns out I didn't need to worry anything about, I didn't need to worry about the crowd response ever. It was different than Berlin. So, you know, UK crowd, different tribe. But what came up was, in this case, was technological considerations. There is a real limitation of current software and hardware, and it truly limited how much improvisation I could do. I'm in conversation with different manufacturers since then, but improvising was nearly impossible, and even performing the material going at different tempi was quite a circus. With the DJ performance, I managed because CDJs are able to handle tracks at different tempi, and then I could have a track at one tempo, loop a bit at one tempo, have another one synced, and then manually bring in another track at another tempo, keeping the original one, being able to come back, but it was a lot of acrobatics. So the process evidenced the limitation of the technology, and yeah, that actually brings me to one of the conclusions. What I figured out from this whole process is that building musical bridges between genres is difficult, but it works. I also discovered that limbo is limited. Metric modulation is by definition a transition technique, and there's just so much time you can spend in the transition. If each tribe is on an island, while bridges are important, they will always be secondary to the islands themselves, to the tribes.